Good evening, fifth grade friends. This is Mr. Lures here, ready to start his first read aloud of the year. This is one of my favorite books from fifth grade, and hopefully you'll enjoy it as well as we read it. It's called My Teacher is an Alien by Bruce Colville. He was an author that's very special to me. And not only did he come to my school when I was in fifth grade, but he actually grew up in upstate New York where I actually grew up. So it's kind of cool to meet a local author right in my own neck of the woods. Many years later, I got to meet him again when he introduced my wife's favorite author, Neil Gaiman, at a author's presentation that we attended right before we moved here to Astoria. So, sit back, relax, enjoy the sounds of Anytown, USA in Astoria as we get started with the first few chapters of My Teacher is an Alien. Chapter 1, Missing. One sixth grade teacher. "Hey, geekoid," yelled Duncan Dougal as he snatched Peter Thompson's book out of his hand. "Why do you read so much? Don't you know how to watch TV?" Poor Peter. I could see he wanted to grab the book back from Duncan, but I also knew that if he tried, Duncan would cream him. Sometimes I wonder if Duncan's mother dropped him on his head when he was a baby. I mean, something must have made him decide to spend his life making other people miserable. Otherwise, why would he spend so much time picking on a kid like Peter Thompson? Peter never bothers anyone. Heck, the only thing he really wants to be is left alone so he can read whatever book he has his nose stuck in the moment. That doesn't seem like too much to ask me, but Duncan takes Peter's reading as a personal insult. So here it was, the first day back from spring vacation. We hadn't even gone into the school yet, and I could tell by the look on Duncan Dougal's face that the spring fight season was about to begin. I clutched my piccolo case to my chest and watched as Peter's pale face began to turn red. Peter blushed at almost anything. He was tall and thin and wore thick glasses. And he was the smartest person I'd ever met, grown-ups included. The problem was, it was all book smarts. Peter had absolutely no idea how to deal with a creep like Duncan. Actually, neither did I. If I did, I would have stopped him. But the one time I had tried to come between Duncan and Peter, I ended up with a black eye myself. Ooh, that might have hurt. Duncan claimed it was an accident, of course. "Susan just jumped right in front of my fist," he said, as if I was the one who had done something wrong. To tell you the truth, I think Duncan punched me on purpose. Most guys wouldn't hit a girl, but Duncan doesn't mind. It was his way of warning me to keep my nose out of his business. As I watched Duncan squinting down at Peter, it occurred to me that sixth grade can be a dangerous place if you don't watch out. Stacy Benoit was standing a few feet away from Peter, pressed against the school wall and looking nervous. Stacy is this incredibly good kid who never gets in trouble, ever. She hates fights even more than I do. She had just started edging her way toward me when Duncan ran his foot through a puddle and splashed dirty water all over Duncan's jeans. "Cut it out, Duncan," said Peter. "Cut it out, Duncan," mimicked Duncan in a whiny, sing-song voice. Anyone who knew Duncan could see he was gearing up for a fight. But it wasn't necessarily going to be with Peter, since Peter usually just took whatever Duncan dished out. I figured Duncan was using him as a warm-up, so I was a little surprised when he tossed Peter's book into the puddle. Even Duncan should have known that was something you just didn't do to Peter. "Oops," he said maliciously. "I dropped it." I heard Stacy gasp as Peter launched himself off the wall and bashed his head into Duncan's stomach. Within 2 seconds, the both of them were rolling around on the ground. "I hate it when this happens," said Stacy as the boys surrounded Peter and Duncan in a shouting, cheering circle. The fight hadn't gone on for more than 10 seconds when a tall blond man came pushing through the crowd. Without saying anything, he grabbed the two fighters and hauled them to their feet. Wow, I thought when I saw him lift the two of them right off the ground, this guy must be very strong. "Stop," he said, and then gave them each a little shake and set them back down on their feet. "Peter started it," said Duncan. He's such a creep he probably didn't even know he was lying. Peter wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. "I did not," he said sullenly. I could see that his hand was trembling. "No more," said the tall man as if he really didn't care who started it. "Do you understand?" Yes, sir," mumbled Peter. I wanted to shake him. It made it sound as if the whole thing had been his fault. "Do you understand?" the tall man said again, looking directly at Duncan. "Sure, I got it," Duncan said. "Good," said the tall man. Then he hurled on his heel and marched back into the school. Duncan made a face at the man's back, then wandered off to find someone else to pick on. "Who was that?" asked Peter, as I handed him his soggy book. "Who knows? I never saw him before. He's probably a new sub. Come on, let's go inside." Peter and I were usually the first ones into school, but not by much. The whole class went in early. That's because our teacher, Miss Marie Swartz, was so totally great. The thing I liked best about having her was that she was the only teacher in Kentucket Falls Elementary who always did a play with her class. I've always wanted to be an actress when I grew up, but until 6th grade, I never had the chance to find out what it was like to be on stage. The play would be our last major project, and we had planned to start rehearsals right after spring vacation. Unfortunately, when we got to our room, Miss Swartz was nowhere to be seen. The tall blonde man was standing beside her desk, talking to a short, red-faced man, who had almost no hair, our school principal, Dr. Bleakman. Where was Miss Swartz? Peter and I went to our desk. I wasn't happy. I had a bad feeling about this. "Ooh, the sub is so handsome," whispered Stacy, who had come in behind us. "I suppose so," I said grudgingly. "Where do you suppose Miss Swartz is?" Stacy shrugged. "Maybe she's sick, or maybe her plane didn't make it back on time. That happened to my 3rd grade teacher once." I nodded. That was okay. It was disappointing to come back to someone besides Miss Swartz, but I could cope with it for a day or two. The other kids came into the room. Because Dr. Bleakman was there, everyone was super quiet. The bell rang, and we took our places. "Good morning, class," said Dr. Bleakman. "I want to introduce Mr. John Smith. Mr. Smith will be your teacher for the rest of the year." The rest of the year? I couldn't believe my ears. "What happened to Miss Swartz?" Without intending to, I asked the question out loud. Chapter 2. The Note of Doom. Dr. Bleakman glared at me. "Susan, if you have something to say, I expect you to raise your hand." Well, excuse me, I thought. But there was no sense in making things worse than they already were, so I raised my hand. When Dr. Bleakman pointed at me, I said as politely as I could, "What happened to Miss Swartz?" "That's a private matter," replied Dr. Bleakman. What was that supposed to mean? Was she pregnant? Did she have some horrible disease? Did she get fired? And whatever it was, why hadn't she warned us? Why hadn't she said goodbye? Without thinking what I was doing, I stood up and said, "I want to know where she is." Dr. Bleakman looked at me in surprise. His cheeks got redder. "Do you know what the meaning of word private is, Miss Simmons?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said quietly, and slipping back into my seat. I sat there, fuming. Dr. Bleakman blathered on about how he expected us to behave for our new teacher. Then he turned us over to Mr. Smith and left the room. As I watched him go, I wondered if Dr. Bleakman had secretly fired Miss Swartz. I'd always suspected he didn't like her, mostly because she didn't do things by the book. I had heard them arguing about it once when I came back to school to get some papers I had left behind. "Miss Swartz, I must ask you to show more respect for the curriculum," Dr. Bleakman had been saying when I walked into the room. Boy, did that set Miss Swartz off. Can't you respect the fact that the kids are learning?" she asked angrily. She grabbed the sides of her head in frustration. Clumps of her frizzy black hair struck out between her fingers. "Listen, Horace, the kids will get more out of 6 weeks of doing a play than 6 months of dittos and workbooks." Suddenly I wondered if having Mr. Smith meant that we wouldn't be doing our play. I began waving my hand in the air again. "Yes, Miss Simmons?" I asked Mr. Smith. "Are we going to have our play still at the end of the year?" I asked. Mr. Smith lifted one blond eyebrow in astonishment. "Play?" he said. "Of course we're not going to do a play. We're here to work." I sank back into my seat. 6th grade was going bad faster than a dead fish on a hot day. I could hear the other kids start to murmur their protests. Mr. Smith slapped his ruler against the desk. "Dr. Bleakman hired me to straighten this class out, and I can see now what he told me about you was correct. Things have gotten completely out of control in this room." Actually, it was only half true. Our room wasn't out of control. It just wasn't under Dr. Bleakman's thumb. Since most of us had already spent 5 years in rooms where the teachers did things Dr. Bleakman's way, we knew very well what he wanted a room to be like. No question about it, Miss Swartz's room didn't fit the bill. But as far as we were concerned, things were going just fine. And not because we were having a good time. We were also learning more than we ever had before. My father claimed we were learning and having a good time for the same reason. Miss Swartz knew how to make things interesting. For example, on the first day of school, Miss Swartz stood at the front of the room and held up the 6th grade reading book Rockets and Flags, popularly known as Rodents and Fleas. "This," she said, "is not a good book." She held it away from her with 2 fingers like a soggy tissue and dropped it into the bottom drawer of her desk. "I know a better one," she said. "In fact, I know hundreds." Then she pulled a huge cardboard box from under her desk and started passing around stacks of paperback novels for us to choose from. We spent the rest of the year reading real books. Sometimes we all read the same one. Sometimes we all read ones that were different. I remember mornings when we spent the entire reading period arguing about what some character should have done. Kids who had never liked reading before were really getting into it. Unfortunately, Mr. Smith didn't believe in that kind of thing. In fact, the first thing he did after taking attendance that morning was pass out copies of Rockets and Flags. Mrs. Swartz always read out loud to us, sometimes twice a day. She read wonderful books like The Hobbit and The Sword and the Stone. When someone asked Mr. Smith if he was going to read out loud, he gave him a funny look and said it was a waste of time. Well, you get the picture. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Smith straightened us out all right. But you know how boring a straight line is. We had no more surprises. We pretty much stopped laughing in school. Things were terrible and just awfully grim. Even the playground wasn't so fun as it had been. Oh, Mr. Smith did keep Duncan Dougal from beating kids up, but he almost went nuts the first time he caught one of us playing a radio. Radios and tape players were banned from the playground. Mr. Smith hated rock music. He hated all music. I could see him shiver every time I picked up my piccolo and left the room for my music lesson. After the 3rd week of this, I said something about it to my music teacher, Mr. Bam Boom Bamwick. Actually, his first name is Milton, but everyone calls him Bam Boom because of his preference for thundering marches. Mr. Bamwick sighed. "Susan, you have to understand that not everyone appreciates the finer things in life," he said. I guess that was as much support as I could expect. You know how teachers stick together. When I got back to the room that day, it was time for our math test. I finished the test early. I was still feeling pretty cranky about Mr. Smith's reaction to my piccolo, so I decided to write a note about it to Stacy. "Mr. Smith is a total creepoid," I wrote. That felt so good I decided to keep going. He has totally ruined this class. Our whole year has gone down the tubes. The man is a total Philistine. Philistine is a word that I just learned from my father. It means someone who has no appreciation for art and beauty. I thought it was a neat word, and I was using it every chance I could get. A few more sentences and I was really wound up. This note was turning into a humdinger. At the bottom I drew an extra tall, extra skinny Mr. Smith, holding his ears while I played the piccolo. It wasn't a very nice picture, but when I was all done, I felt better. I slipped the note under my test and waited for a chance to pass it to Stacy. I began thinking about how she'd react to my picture. I imagined her laughing so hard she'd fall off her chair. Unfortunately, while I was daydreaming, Mr. Smith started collecting papers. By the time I saw him walking up my row, it was too late to move the note. As I watched in horror, he snatched up my test and my note along with it. A wave of terror lashed over me. I watched Mr. Smith walk away with my ghastly note. I closed my eyes and swallowed. I was doomed. So, friends, that was the first 2 chapters of My Teacher is an Alien. Next time, we'll hopefully find out what happens when Mr. Smith sees the note and maybe learn a bit more about who the alien possibly could be. Maybe some of you already have an idea of who the alien could be. But until then, I'm Mr. Lures, and we'll see you next time.